So today is the 18th of January, 2551. We've just completed the 7 days of practice in honour and memory of our teacher, Luang Por Chah, up in Ubon, 16 years after his death. It's a time to recollect the way of practice, the way of training that Luang Por Chah left us. This is the way of practice that leads to the end of suffering and provides our hearts and minds with the means to transcend all conditions, all moods, all sense objects, through abandoning all forms of craving and attachment in the mind. I remember before I ordained as a monk, I went to pay respects to Luang Por Chah at Wat Pung Latiwan, near my home, where I was born and where I was living and working at that time. I'd already begun practicing the Dhamma at home because I'd started quite naturally to contemplate and see the suffering inherent in our life as human beings, to see the attachments that we build up and how many problems and how much suffering they bring to us. So I was looking for a way out of dukkha, out of suffering. This is the beginning of the noble path. This is the noble truth of dukkha ariya satcha. And dukkha is something that has to be known, penetrated, understood. And it leads on to the quest, the search to find the true path out of dukkha, away from dukkha. And this is what it means to practice following the teachings or the way of the Lord Buddha. First we practice from the books, from listening to teachers. Then we go on to develop that practice in our own minds. We go to the monasteries, spend time meditating, contemplating, keeping precepts, and importantly associating with the Sangha. And this is an important cause and condition for our progress in the practice, especially in the beginning. Just as the Buddha said, Sevana Chabalanang Banditanancha Sevana, by associating with the wise, those who have experience in the practice, this will lead to progress. So before I became a monk, I actually went to visit many teachers of the forest tradition, mostly disciples of Venerable Ajahn. One teacher in particular I became close to was Luang Por Bunna, who had been living at that time with Luang Por Khao for about 5 years. But he had also studied with many of the great teachers of the era, Luang Por On, Luang Por Phan, Luang Por Lui, Luang Por Pan, and so on. That year he came to practice in Sarapuri, near my home, so I had the chance to visit him many times. And this increased my faith in the way of practice, hearing his teachings, asking him questions. And my faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and the path of practice really became strong then. Once we have faith, then we start to think about the Dhamma and develop right view. We develop that strong conviction in karma and its fruits, in the existence of other realms of existence, hell, heaven, and so on, to see that all beings, when they die, they go according to the fruits of their karma. They're born and die, and it's so easy to make bad karma and fall into a birth in one of the 4 realms of misery, the abhaya bhumis. But all of this stems from the mind, our minds. Hell and heaven, they come from the mind. They're created by our minds. Even Nibbana comes from the mind. Nibbana means the mind that is free from kilesa, free from greed, hatred and delusion. It's that purity of mind, and that's what we call Nibbana. The Lord Buddha was one who was free from kilesa. He'd completely abandoned all kilesa, all greed, hatred and delusion from his mind. It was samucceda pahana, completely gone, abandoned. And we're receiving the fruits of his great compassion through his teachings and the way of practice that he left us. Ever since the time of the Buddha, the enlightened Sangha has come into being Those who have the faith to practice follow the way of practice right through to the cessation of all dukkha and the ending of the abandonment of all defilements. And that's been continuing ever since the time of the Buddha, right down to the present day, to our teacher Luang Por Chah. So once we have faith in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, this is the cause, the motivation to practice. That year I sent Luang Por Budna to spend the rains with Luang Por Lui, one of his teachers. That was another chance to hear the Dhamma. It was at that time that I began to become inspired not just to keep the 5 precepts regularly, but to keep the 8 precepts and to increase my efforts in bhavana, in meditation. The practice of bhavana, or mental cultivation, is the way to develop a peaceful mind. We have to use a gammatana, a meditation object. And this could be recollection of the qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, the recollection of death, marananusati, where we contemplate that life is uncertain, death is certain, or the recollection of the in-breath and the out-breath, anapanasati. Whatever meditation object we used, we have to depend on our own skill and efforts to develop that. But if we keep changing objects all the time, that will be the cause for confusion and disturbance in the mind, and it will increase our doubts about the practice. At that time I was still working, so I had to combine my practice with working. After I got home at night, I practiced meditation, and this was a way to rest the mind after a full day's work. In the morning before going out to work, I chanted and meditated, and I would put food in the bowls of the monks who would visit our neighborhood every day. On the weekends I would go and stay in the temple to study and practice. And when listening to the Dhamma, I came to understand how suffering arises in the mind, how we attach to all the sense contact we see. When the eyes see a form, the ears hear a sound, the nose contacts smells, tongue contacts taste, body contacts touch, or the mind itself experiencing different objects, Dhamma aramanas. Through attachment we tend to see them as good and bad, and the good objects we start liking and wanting. The bad ones we have aversion for, we don't like, don't want. And this conditions the mind. So we have to learn how to see these objects and this sense contact with mindfulness and wisdom. To contemplate, to see that really they're all just elements of nature that are arising and passing away. The eye, the form that the eye sees, and the visual consciousness that arises, these are all just elements in nature. They're what we call samuti satcha, conventional reality. But through our ignorance we immediately give labels to all these objects. We give labels and descriptions that take over the mind. So for instance, we have this building, we call it a sala. You can have a different name for this sala building in whatever language you speak. But the sala itself doesn't know anything. It doesn't know its name. This sala doesn't know if it's a big sala, a small sala. It doesn't know anything. All of that are the labels and the apparent reality that we put onto it. If we train our minds to penetrate and see through this is the way to reach vimutti, liberation. It's through seeing through samuti, or conventional reality, to this deeper truth that we can free our minds from attachment. Or like say this glass here, what we call a glass, when the mind has contemplated with mindfulness and wisdom, we can penetrate through to see that really what we call a glass is just 4 elements, earth, air, fire and water, that come together. This is what we call insight, and the effect on the mind is that it brightens the mind and brings peace to the mind. And we come to understand the teaching, all the different teachings that the Buddha gave, that when we attach, suffering must arise, and it's because of delusion. So we come to see all material phenomena are subject to the 3 characteristics of existence. They're impermanent, unsatisfactory, and they lack a self, a substantial, enduring self. Insight means that it's no longer just a memory or thinking about these teachings, but actually knowing clearly with one's own heart. This is what we mean by panya, or pavana maya panya. And this is what leads us to give up attachment. And the result is increasing faith and conviction in the practice, increasing rapture and happiness in the mind, and contentment that comes through seeing the true nature of reality. I experienced this at this time, sometimes for periods of many, many days on end, having come to see this truth so clearly in the heart at that time. I could also see the value of the way of training, the value of using sila, for living in a virtuous way, to support meditation. And I could see the way samadhi supports the arising of wisdom. At that time I had no wish to collect any wealth from the work I was doing. I was doing dana every day. I would make offerings to monks, go to the temple and make offerings. Because I could see that when we leave this world, when we die, we can't take any of that wealth with us. We leave everything behind. So by the year 2519, I was ready to consider taking the robes, asking to be admitted to the Sangha. And that was the year I travelled to Wat Nong Bapong to take up the training of a bhikkhu. By that time I was already using Marananusati as my regular meditation object, recollecting death all the time. All the time I could see that death is the only certainty in life. Life itself and everything else in this world is uncertain. And I'd apply this reflection to any attachment that arose in the mind. Really, this is what we call a samatha practice, a way of making the mind firm and concentrated. But because of the nature of the object, contemplating death, it leads quite naturally on to the practice of vipassana, insight meditation. And this is the way that, one of the ways we can make our minds peaceful. So once I arrived at Wat Nong Bapong to begin my training as a bhikkhu, Luang Por Chah taught that in the beginning of the practice we have to be humble. We have to develop a sense of respect for our fellow samanas in the Sangha. We have to set aside our background and our normal clinging to the status, our education, wealth and so on that we usually held to in the lay life. We have to give all of this up. Because we're beginning the practice, although we take on the robes of a monk, a bhikkhu, and shave our heads, this is still just a convention, samuti, satcha. It's not yet that the mind of a monk, the mind of a bhikkhu has arisen inside our mind, our heart yet. So we have to learn how to give up our attachment to views and opinions and conceit. If we become a pakhau, an anagarika, we have to learn how to respect a novice. A novice has to respect the bhikkhus. Junior bhikkhus respect senior bhikkhus and so on. We have to learn how to practice moderation in the use of the four requisites. We have to learn how to contemplate every day. For instance, when we take food, we have to learn how to eat just enough for our needs, not to indulge. When we sleep, we have to learn how to sleep just enough for our needs and not to indulge. We have to learn how to practice sense restraint with sati, with mindfulness, when we have sense contact, when there's seeing arising, when there's hearing arising, tasting, touching and so on. We use mindfulness with all of this sense contact. We use mindfulness at that point where the internal ayatana and the external ayatana meet. All this information that comes to us through our senses, the sense doors, it comes down to the mind. So this is where we also have to observe with mindfulness, guard over the mind to stop it falling into liking and disliking. When you contemplate this, you can see that liking and disliking is existence, it's bhava, which leads on to jati, birth, It's the cause for fresh birth. And where there's birth, it must follow on to, with old age, sickness and death, more suffering. The first year as a bhikkhu, I had plenty of energy in the practice. Much piti and sukha was arising, sometimes for many days, sometimes for many months at a time. The 5 hindrances seemed to become something that was external to the mind, because internally the mind was very still and peaceful. I could still have sleepiness arise because the mind and the body were becoming tired, but this was more like an external affair, because inside the citta was still and peaceful. I once went to ask Luang Por Chah what I should do once the mind is still, how I should practice. I'd already been thinking about contemplating the citta itself, thinking this must be the way to go, to purify it, just to purify it from any attachments and delusions. But he said, contemplate the body. And out of respect for my teacher, I believed him and took that teaching away to practice. And I began to make this the foundation of the development of wisdom and insight, the contemplation and investigation of the body. And this is an important point. When you have a teacher, you have to learn how to respect your teacher's guidance and advice. In the practice of samatha, I was using the recollection of death and anapanasati to make the mind peaceful. So it was not yet what you would call practicing a supa gammatana. This is the method what we call panya developing samadhi, or wisdom developing samadhi. Using recollection, using wisdom to make the mind peaceful. Luang Por Chah said sometimes you don't actually need to use a nimitta of anything to teach the mind to see that the body is anicca, dukkha, anatta. Sometimes you just contemplate it for yourself, reasoning through in your state of peace, and that's enough for the mind to understand and let go. And if that works, that's okay. From that time, as I explained last night, I took the time to find the chance to go and stay in cremation grounds, places where people had been burnt or buried, as a very useful technique for dealing with fear and really contemplating, getting down to the heart of attachment. When we contemplate, we're contemplating in the present moment. We learn to see that death is imminent in the present moment. This is what gives rise to immediate awareness in the present moment, and the result is a cool, peaceful mind. So from my first few vases, this is how I was practicing. By the 4th vasa, my mind started to attain very deep, concentrated states of peace, and I could see how nibbana was very close by. But however long the length of time that the mind goes into a state of deep, peaceful stillness, it always has to withdraw from that state because it's still a sankata dhamma, an impermanent condition. So we have to learn how to keep bringing up effort into the practice, to keep developing this stillness and keep investigating, contemplating. We have to contemplate the impermanence of this body, the fact that we're going to die, contemplate how to see how this body is made up of the 4 elements of earth, air, fire and water. Use this as our gammatana. The death recollection and the contemplation of the elements are still samatha techniques to calm the mind, but they run quite naturally into the contemplation of the 3 characteristics, applying them to this body, and that's what we call vipassana. As I proceeded to experience better results from my practice, this of course gave me greater confidence and conviction in the practice and greater energy. And sometimes I could see that even though our efforts, we seem to be putting in maximum effort and we can get tired and we don't seem to be quite there yet, actually insight is right around the corner, very close, and it only needs a slight increase in effort for us to see something or have a breakthrough. We need to keep investigating the body over and over again to see its unattractive side, to see how it's impermanent, subject to change, to see its fragility and unsatisfactoriness. And this body is just a bag of skin that encloses all the organs, the flesh, the bones and liquids of the body. We have to keep investigating this way to see the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness and lack of self in this body. And this is the way that our doubts and uncertainty about the practice will be removed, and we'll be surer and surer of the way to practice, the efficacy of the practice, and we'll be confident that it's the way that leads to a peaceful mind and a pure mind. We have to accept that the practice of samadhi is difficult to develop, so we have to use patience and endurance, especially in the beginning. We have to keep at it, keep applying our minds to the barikamma, the preparatory meditation object. We might use Buddho or Dhammo or Sangho as a kammatthana. But at the same time we have to learn how to have a balanced effort, how to relax our efforts if we're getting too stressed or too tense. You don't want to concentrate so hard that you put yourself into a painful, stressful state of mind or body. So find the right balance. As the mind starts to experience some peace, then the 5 hindrances will fade away, and we'll learn how we can take refuge in the mind itself. Because really our mind, the peaceful mind of samadhi, is the only real refuge in this world. Just like on a hot day when we want to go into our kuti to get into the shade and find some coolness out of the hot sun. Similarly, we practice samadhi to let the mind go into this state of coolness and happiness where it's free and away from the stresses of the world. So samatha is a practice we have to develop often, but from this we learn to investigate the Dhamma as well, and we have to do that often. This is the only way we can reach Magga Samadhi, where all the factors of the path come together unifying in the mind, Sila, Samadhi and Panya. And we have to understand that sometimes the mind becomes stubborn. It doesn't want to investigate. It likes to attach to the stillness, the coolness of samadhi. So we have to be aware of that, be ready for that. Sometimes I've found periods when large numbers of nimittas would come up into the mind and try to overwhelm or confuse the mind. You still have to apply sati and panya and the 3 characteristics to your experience, whether you're having no nimittas, a few nimittas or a lot of nimittas. You have to learn how to use these 3 characteristics, apply them to anything arising into your experience so that you can let go of it, see through it, penetrate it. Get through to that state where you can see it as the 3 characteristics or the 4 elements. And this is what leads to that emptiness of mind that comes with insight. Whatever the mind attaches to, we must investigate it in our own minds constantly. Sometimes we might see our own image of the subtle body inside our minds. The subtle body that we can see in our mind, it might become so subtle that we just see this body as threads, strands of light or air. This is an expression of peace and insight, the result of our practice. Once on Tudong, one night I was practicing, I saw the body as it was revealed as the 3 characteristics. I could see how both the practice of samadhi has its levels of refinement. We go from the coarse through to the refined in concentrating the mind. Similarly, insight has its levels of refinement. We might have some deep insight that reveals the body as impermanent, unsatisfactory and not self, but then a subtle sense of self can form around that insight, and we can say, I have insight, this is my insight. So we must learn to contemplate that. We have to see that there's always a more refined level of attachment forming, and be ready to contemplate that. Sometimes we might see the body as the earth element, but keep investigating to let go of any sense of self that forms around that insight. This, what we call sabhava dhamma, where the mind sees the true essence, true nature of reality. We have to keep coming back to the basics in practice. Don't see the barikamma as a coarse thing just a beginner's practice that we should soon give up. It's something you have to keep returning to and keep developing, because this is our vehicle for developing the piti and the sukha that gives the mind that sense of detachment and ease inside. You have to learn how to use the parikamma to bring up piti and sukha regularly. This is the only way the mind will become firm in samadhi. When you've practiced parikamma to the point where piti becomes really firm, then your mind seems unshakable, and it will keep going in, penetrating inwards deeper and deeper. With this, the piti and sukha will develop, and from this our insight will develop, and that also develops further piti and sukha. As our investigation of the body deepens from contemplating the external 32 parts, we analyze it, break it down, we start to see it as the 4 elements. Sometimes I'd have experiences, many different variations of insight would arise. For instance, I might be contemplating and see the head as anicca, dukkha, anatta. At that time, the whole head would seem to become disjointed from the rest of the body, like a white lump, a white mass just floating off from the body. That's just one typical example of how insight, how it might reveal itself, give its result. But there's many variations on this. The main thing is that it's an expression of the purity of mind, the mind freeing itself from greed, hatred and delusion at that time. We also have to learn how to contemplate Vedana. When we're ill, when we're tired, we have to learn how to keep this body and mind light in a wholesome state of mind with mindfulness and unattached to the Vedana, even when there's severe illness. We have to see all the sabhava dhammas, all those elements and things that exist in nature, whether of the past, the present or the future, all as the same. They all just arise and pass away. There's no self in any of it. There's no sense of me being something. Even the sense of me being an Arya Pugala who has seen the Dhamma, that's just another thing to let go of, to see through. The mind will keep developing samadhi, keep developing panya, and free itself from attachment if we keep practicing in this way. Sometimes the most marvelous, miraculous things can happen. That year at Wat Nongpapong, 2536, and my mind practicing there when Luang Por Chah was still alive, the mind seemed to come together 3 times into deep samadhi and then withdraw out of that experience. And at that time I was investigating the body. Having investigated the body to see it as anicca, dukkha, anatta, the mind went in again, came out again, investigated further, went in again, 3 times. Coming out of that experience, it seemed that all phenomena in this world are empty of any form of self. All material things have no basis in self. And practicing on like that to the year 2538, 2539. I could see that all forms of attachment that form for any kind of material phenomena in this world, they're just a cause for further existence and birth, more power, more jati. Even the most simple mood of the mind, say the dislike for the company of other people, dislike going to meetings, chanting, meditating together, I could see even that, or the desire to just be alone in the forest, is still a form of existence and birth in the mind. It's still bhava and jati. We have to learn how to contemplate in this way, to see through all conventions and attachment to conventional reality, to see that there really is no self on any level. And when you reach the highest level of this insight, there's really nothing left to speak about. It goes beyond anything that words can describe. So please contemplate this. See how the Buddhist path that leads to the end of suffering, it's based on the practice of this Dhamma, this Vinaya, and it's for the ending of all attachments. We don't have to be in doubt about the teachings of Luang Por Man, Luang Por Chah. It all begins with this practice of Parikamma Bhavana. In the beginning we have to struggle and put effort into it, but later it will become more natural, more automatic to the mind. Luang Por Chah once reflected to me when talking about people going to India to pay respects to the Bodhi tree where the Buddha was enlightened. He said, "Can't the Lord Buddha arise in Thailand?" Meaning that Buddha nature, the pure mind of the Buddha, can't it arise anywhere in the world through the practice? He left this as a teaching for us to contemplate and to follow. It's up to us to make our mind the mind of Buddha or Buddho, one that is awake and realized. So please determine your hearts and minds to put all your efforts into the practice. Annamayang avadakatha sadhu karang datamase